Good evening. Good evening. I am Arra Avakian, and I am sure that if you were in my place, you would be just as happy as I am now to greet you, and so pleased to see that we were faced with this trivial little problem of setting up more chairs. This is always a good thing. This is a very exciting moment for us, because in a sense it is, it is a breathless sort of moment. It is a heartbeat skipping sort of experience that we feel at this particular moment. I don't know whether I might say it is like driving in the golden spike that was used to join the two ends of the first transcontinental railway, or if it is like the occasion of breaking a bottle of champagne over the bow of the aircraft carrier Forrestal, or like laying in the cornerstone of a great new secretariat building. But it is just about the same sort of feeling that I have here, and I want to tell you more about it. We have now to tell you about the formation. The society has been formed as a result of a need which has been strong enough to create an environment that caused people to come together to satisfy this particular need. And we have called you here tonight because things you have said in the past, things that you write, the way you feel, and we have heard you in expressing yourselves, lead us to believe that you want to be interested, or you want to be a part of this association which has just been formed, and we call it the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, the NAASR. Some of us have already come to the point of calling it intimately NAASR. You must, of course, have a name for it. Well, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. We are ready to launch it, and you are here because you are probably ready to become its charter members. In my simple simile a moment ago, I didn't say it was as though we were driving the first spike in what was going to be a first railway across the country, or that we were laying the keel of the Forrestal, or even that we were turning the first spade of earth in preparation for the building of a secretariat. No, I didn't mean it in particular, because the spade work has already been done. We have been looking over the problem. We have investigated the field. We have done this spade work. We have planted the seed, and the sprout has grown, and you are now the sunlight and the water and the energy ready to bring this sprout into full maturity. Yes, we've done this spade work. We've turned the soil over and over again, making it fine and clean. We have prepared a bed. We have planted the seed, and in the course of a certain period of time, it has germinated, it is sprouted, and the time is now. It is time for charter members to take over the association and make it possible for it to carry on its work and bring it into full fruition. I would like to trace for you the immediate circumstances that led up to this. There is really no beginning to the story. It has always existed as a need, as a condition. Over a period of many months or latent years, many, you, others, have thought about this problem. Sometimes you have expressed it to others, or you have exchanged opinions, and you've asked the question, why not? Why should we not have in America, for Armenians, an important center for study, for important scholastic work, a center for research, a magnificent library, a spring that is a source for scholarship. Why not these things? And a particular center in which Armenian scholars or Armenologists throughout the world would take an interest in, they would participate in the activities of such a center, and I mean one not circumscribed as it would be if its nature were strictly an Armenian one, but rather broader and more general, universal, as it would be in the environment of this very general environment of one of America's great universities. The late Professor Blake of Harvard University, whom many of you may know, or certainly all of you know of him, himself would have asked the same question, or more particularly, I know that he had asked the same question: why not have such a center, an environment created in such a very natural spot as in this particular university, where we may have this very thing that we're describing. This was the very need that some of us sensed. By twos we came together, by threes we began to exchange these opinions, and it began to take form. Over a period of many, many weeks or months, many evenings, long discussions to test the idea, test it again, to prove it, to determine if a program, as you will hear described more during the evening, is right and ready, and we concluded that it was right and ready. We are now at just this very moment. The sprout is ready, the organization is now ready for launching. The association has been established, as I told you, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. It has elected a temporary board of directors, and it has elected a temporary chairman. Your chairman for the evening tonight, the temporary chairman of the association, will take over in a moment. He is a young man who first studied in a technical field at Northeastern and at MIT, with his undergraduate work completed in mathematics and physics. An interlude involving the war showed that his aptitudes and particular qualifications marked him to go into another field. And on his return, he entered Clark University and completed some graduate work for the master's degree, and his thesis topic was Russia and Armenia from 1700 to 1923. This was a very natural undertaking of his, for during the war, starting off first, strangely, as a radio repairman, it soon became evident that this was not his proper duty in the army, but rather he entered the German Language Research Center and was also an information education man in the military service. Now he is a candidate for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy at Clark University, and his basic research there is related to the same question, more particularly Russia and the Armenian question since 1917. He will take over the chair, and I introduce to you Mr. Manoog Young.
Thank you, Arra. I have the pleasure of being the chairman for the meeting this evening, and I have, right from the beginning, even before we start, a feeling of frustration. A feeling of frustration because we have so much to tell you and so little time in which to tell you. As Arra has mentioned, we have been in the works for almost 6 to 8 months. We have had innumerable meetings. I think if we add them up, they come to over 30 meetings. We have given many precious hours. Some of our members have taken precious time away from their families, their children, and their work in order to bring this organization along to the point we have today. But before I tell you much more about what we're trying to do, I think I ought to tell you a few words about our previous speaker. Most of you know Dr. Avakian, but there may be some of you who don't know really how extensive a background he has had, both in his field of work and in his field of interest. He was born in this city of Boston, made his way to California, and then came back and entered MIT and got his bachelor's and doctor's degree in mathematics and physics. He had a long career of work as a statistician, a physicist, an engineer, and now he is executive engineer for one of our outstanding research organizations in this area. But all the time that he was doing this as his work, his other hours were spent always in pursuing various avenues of research in Armenian history, church history, language, to the point that he has become one of our younger authorities on the Armenian language, on many aspects of the Armenian church and other aspects of Armenian history, to the point that he has become qualified and is now teaching one of the language courses that are being sponsored by the Division of University Extension of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Arra is one of our two instructors. Later on, I hope to introduce to you the other instructor so that you will know who he is anyway. As I said, I don't know just quite where to start, and I'm sure when the evening is over, we will think of a lot of things we should have said and we didn't say. And we hope at that time, if some of the questions you ask will point up some of the things we haven't covered, we will answer them for you. If you are looking at your program in front of you, you will notice that we have 6 speakers altogether, but I can assure you most of us will not take any more time than Arra took in his initial opening remarks. We want to reserve the major portion of our time to our 2 professors from Harvard University who can give a good deal more information on what the background of the problem is than we can. Arra mentioned that we have founded an organization, National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. On one of the sheets that you have in front of you, you will find listed the purposes and objectives of this organization. I might say that we started out with a specific goal in mind, the goal of seeing established at a university like Harvard a professorship or chair of Armenian studies, a permanent professorship or a permanent chair, a chair that would be in existence today, tomorrow, 50 years from now, or 500 years from now, God willing. A chair which could be the means for fostering research and studies and publications. But as we got together and thought this problem over, we realized there are a lot of other things that have to be done too. The chair in itself will not solve all the problems that we have in front of us insofar as the advancement of Armenian studies is concerned. So that is why, when you look at the purposes here, you will find that there are very general purposes, that they cover a lot of other areas of activity that we hope in the course of time we can embark upon. So that the activities that would go on with a chair, once it is established here, would be augmented with other activities. And that is the basis for the general nature of the purposes of the organization, as you see on the sheet in front of you. The objectives which are listed below, 9 of them in number, are what we call goals or projects. These are things we hope to achieve in the course of time. Number 1 is the one that we're concerned with the most now. Number 1 is the one that we will spend probably 85 or 90% of our time on at present, until such time as it has become a reality. Some of the others we have already embarked upon to a certain extent already. Some of them will probably not be tackled for years to come. Well, these are the sort of objectives that we feel an organization like this should be dedicated to in order that it may enhance the entire program of advancing Armenian studies in the United States. And we feel that the Harvard Chair is the number one objective, the most important objective, and the people of Greater Boston have a singular opportunity to make this chair a reality. As the evening develops, you will hear more about the chair, you'll hear more about how we hope to establish it, you'll hear more about what we expect you as members of the Armenian and American community to do, and I'm sure when the end of the evening comes, you will join with us in trying to make this a reality. The next speaker that we have on the program is a young man. I hope he doesn't mind my referring to him as a young man, because I think he will verify this when he gets up, who has cut quite a path already in the field of Armenian studies and Middle Eastern studies. He was educated in the Middle West, got his bachelor's degree from a Middle Western University, University of Illinois, at a very young age of 19. He started school when he was 15 and got his degree when he was 19. He came to Harvard thereafter and studied for his master's degree, got that, and while he was in the beginnings of studying for his doctor's degree, he was called to Washington to work in the Afghan Middle East desk of the State Department, and shortly thereafter he went overseas as a member of the OSS in intelligence work. He was there for 3 years, all over the Middle East, from Turkey to Iran to Afghanistan to Egypt, most all of the countries of the Middle East. Of course, this fitted in very perfectly with his area of interest, which was Middle Eastern studies, and particularly Persian history and language. When he came back from the war and resumed the studies for his PhD here at Harvard, Professor Blake got a hold of him one day and said, "Now look, you are expecting to be a scholar in Persian history and language. How can you be a scholar in this field without knowing Armenian?" So whether he liked it or not, he had to study Armenian. And he didn't learn the Armenian you and I speak at home. He learned Karapat, the very difficult classical Armenian. He tells me that he sweated many hours over this language to master it to the point that he was able to translate a very important and valuable document later on. This, I think, was his last language. He had by this time mastered some 12 languages, and Armenian became the last one, the crowning achievement, as it were. I think we are very grateful that he did finally get to the Armenian, because it's just any one man who has probably been a gadfly in our midst. Trying to get this thing going, I think it is the next speaker. Professor Frye has been teaching here at Harvard for quite a few years now, and he is an associate professor of Middle Eastern Studies. He is also listed in the catalog as an instructor in Armenian. He has published a number of books on the Middle East, and he has translated one manuscript or chronicle called The History of the Nation of the Archers, which is a story of the Mongol occupation of Asia Minor, and particularly that of Armenia during the period of the Cilician Armenian Kingdom. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce to you Professor Richard N. Frye of Harvard University.
I must apologize for my miserable voice this evening. I have quite a bad cold, so I hope you can hear me in the back of the room. Now, when Mr. Young asked me to say a few words this evening, he suggested that I not say anything about philological gymnastics, as I did once before, such as trying to derive a Turkish eşek from Armenian, or to talk about such things as the differences between met Tagavor Hayot and Tagavor Metzat Hayot in the relation to the Middle Persian inscriptions. So I told him, all right, I'll talk very generally then about Armenian history and about Armenian studies in this country very briefly, such as they are not. Now, frequently I am asked, well, is there anything really to be done in Armenian? I mean, in Armenian history and literature, classical Armenian. Haven't all of the classics been translated? Haven't all of them been studied time and time again? Well, unfortunately, the answer is no, not by a long shot. As a matter of fact, we don't even have decent and I mean adequate editions of the Armenian classics. And in this I'm joined by a number of people, mekatarists in Vienna and Venice, who say that the only Armenian texts which we really have are three which were published in Tiflis shortly before World War I. And I assure you that there are considerable numbers of manuscripts which have not been investigated in various parts of the Middle East, in Jerusalem, in Julfa, in Isfahan, and in other places in Lebanon and also in Egypt. Not to mention this country. Just a few weeks ago I saw a collection of over 200 Armenian manuscripts, of which I am sure at least a third had not been published in any form. So there's a considerable amount of work to be done. And as far as the translations go, or studies of classics, we're only just beginning. But this is a rather specialized work, of course. Edition of texts and translations, the study of history. What about general considerations of Armenian history? Well, as far as work to be done is concerned, there again we are abysmal in our ignorance. I mean, just take the prehistory of the Armenians, if you will, the kingdom of Urartu, the Chaldeans in what is today Azerbaijan and eastern Turkey and Transcaucasia. Every year new inscriptions are turned up. Only last year in Persian Azerbaijan, two very important royal inscriptions in cuneiform were found. These haven't been worked over. These haven't really been studied. We have no corpus. And these are essential. These are prime materials for a prehistory of Armenia. I mean, there are many questions yet which remain to be solved. Now, I recall 3 years ago when I was in Tehran, a French-Armenian scholar came through and tried to, well, he did convince me, as a matter of fact, that we ought to get together and use my jeep and make a trip in Azerbaijan to investigate the Armenian churches, most of them in ruins, which hadn't been investigated by any means. And we didn't get very far because of political difficulties, but it was really amazing to me to see the vast field for art historians and for those interested in the history of architecture and culture. You all know the contribution which the Armenians have made to architecture, and that the buildings in Byzantium, the great capital of the East Roman Empire, that you had a regular guild almost which was dominated by the Armenian architects. Well, there's a lot of material yet to be uncovered, unearthed in this early period. But my concern is that, as many of you have heard before, is not so much with Armenia simply as Armenian history. Somebody may well ask, well, all right, this is who's really interested in Armenian history except a few of the old people? Not even the young people are interested in Armenia anymore. I mean, the Armenian descent. But this Armenia is not a question for just Armenians. It's a part of world history. And this is something which I've been trying to push time and time again, that Armenia has a great deal to offer to world history. If you look in the books of the Armenians, these classics, the histories, the geographies, books on literature, You find very important sources for a knowledge of their neighbors. For instance, one of the most important sources on the Zoroastrian religion is an Armenian book by Esnik on the heresies. Also, I can't escape this since I've been working on it a little bit myself, this concept of Great Armenia. Really, it meant something in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD to the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. The very fact that both of them in Greek, Latin sources as well as in Persian sources, you have an extraordinary amount of attention devoted to this concept of Great Armenia, I think is very significant. Again, not merely as a piece of internal history or the history of Transcaucasia, but as a part of the whole system of politics and international history, if you will, of that period, of the Near East and of the Roman Empire and the Persian Empires, world history of that time. Well, I don't want to bore you or go into any details of this very interesting period of history when Christianity came to Armenia. But I wish to emphasize and re-emphasize again that the history of Armenia is something not only of significance or of interest to those who are solely interested in Armenian history, but it has very great relevance indeed to the history of the Near East and, if you will, to world history of the time. And if you go on down through the course of the ages into the Middle Ages and the modern times, we find that the establishment of the kingdom of Cis in Cilicia has an extremely important relation to the history of the Crusades and this whole problem of the transmission of classical culture to the West through the Arabs and through direct contacts with the French, especially the French crusaders who came to the East. There is, for instance, a manuscript on the Chronicle, the Royal Kings of Cilicia, which Professor Blake worked on before his death, which still remains unedited, untranslated, unstudied. And I hope that this is one thing that someday will come out and will be published. So here and there you see that there are considerable tasks to be performed in elucidating the history of Armenia. And because in later times of the spread of Armenians all over the Near East and all over the world, you have a very important, interesting phenomenon here in this spread of a small people, the influences which they had in the Near East, on Near Eastern history, Ottoman history, and so on. I had intended to go somewhat into detail, but since I feel my voice weakening a little just now, I think that I shan't continue in this vein, but turn again to the problem, the question of Armenian studies in this country. To me, it's really astounding that at no time in this country has there been a professorship or indeed any prolonged permanent teaching on a university level of Armenian history, Armenian language, Armenian literature. It's true that here and there people have given courses, people have been interested, but the Armenian language, which has a very long tradition, as you well know, way back to prehistoric times, you might say, with the Urartians or the Chaldeans, and right on through the Achaemenid period, when we have inscriptions which I maintain are in Armenian, although they are written in Aramaic. There'll be an article about this in the next issue of the Armenian Review in Boston. Right on through this period, down to the invention of the alphabet by Mesrop and Sahak, conversion of Armenia to Christianity, this continuous thread down to modern times, showing the homogeneity of a people and the really tremendous strength of a people not only desirous but actually sacrificing themselves to maintain a tradition. It's awfully difficult to maintain a tradition away from in other countries scattered throughout the world here and there, but the Armenians have done just that. So it is really surprising that in this country, and one might say in the world for that matter, except if you would discount or accept such places as the Mechatarists in Vienna, who after all are not in a university, they are monks, very scholarly ones at that. There is no place in the world really where you have a center of Armenian studies. You have a professor in Paris look at the chairs of Arabic which have been established in this country for many decades in many of the prominent universities. You see that in the case of Armenian we are far behind. Therefore I think that this project of establishing a chair of Armenian studies has much more to it than simply establishing a place where Armenian is taught continuously. It has a much greater significance than that. It really means putting Armenian in its proper place on the world stage, putting Armenian history, if you will, in its proper place in world history, putting the Armenian language in its proper place with other languages and other literatures, where it belongs. And this, I think, is a point which should be stressed and remembered and kept in mind now when succeeding speakers talk to you. Well, with these few words, and begging your pardon for my rather unhappy voice this evening, I thank you very much.
If we may digress from Armenian studies for a moment, I would like to read out 5 number plate numbers. The owners of these cars are asked to move their cars. They are parked right here in front of the building. The first one, or else they'll be towed away. The first one is an Austin H69325. Second one is an Oldsmobile 68713. Third one is a Buick 1624. Fourth one is a Chevrolet H7841. There's one more. The last one is a Nash 826078. I see there are no Chrysler products in the list. Professor Frye mentioned the need for Armenian studies in terms of specific examples in Armenian history. I'm sure as some of you were listening to him, you were probably asking yourselves the question, or the question you would like to ask him, what about what is going on in Armenia right now? Aren't they conducting Armenian studies there, Armenian research in all studies, in all aspects? And of course the answer to that is a very obvious yes. But the difficulty with what is going on in Armenia today is that all of this material is being produced in one language, for the most part, and that's in Armenian, and to a slight extent in Russian. The results of the researches and investigations that are going on there are of no value to us in this country, because we are witnessing the phenomena of assimilation, where our younger people are growing up and not having the ability to read or write Armenian. Here in Boston, Armenian courses have been started up through the University Extension Program, and we have at the most 50 people enrolled in 2 courses. There are some 25,000 Armenians in this area. From all of their children, we have 25 taking the course. And I'm not so sure with all the Armenian they will learn that they'll still be able to read these books and materials that are coming out of Armenia. Secondly, there is the problem of the Iron Curtain. So that what we need in this country are histories and monographs and grammars and dictionaries in the English language or for the use of translation purposes. And this is what we think, among other things, a chair at a university like Harvard will accomplish. The scholars that will be graduated from here will be able to write histories, will be able to write articles and monographs. And these will be published. They'll be in the English language. And so that 90% of the younger generation, which will know no Armenian, even though they should, will be able to read about their people, will be able to know about the rich Armenian history. Also, this material will be of value to scholars in other fields who know no Armenian. And as an example of that, or thinking of that, I'm thinking now of our next speaker. I was going to go on to the next speaker, and I'm just informed that our violinist is here, but let me finish this trend of thought. I may just jump the gun a little bit and say that Professor Langer, who will be the next speaker after our violinist, way back in the 30s, published a book called Diplomacy of Imperialism. And this is one of the first books in American historical tradition, or history, that spends a considerable amount of the book, or a considerable amount of its pages, on Armenian history. It's a 2-volume book, and over 100 pages are spent on the period of the Armenian massacres and the reform movements that were attempted after 1878. Professor Langer, in telling me about the research problems he had in writing this book, told me that he was handicapped in that he didn't know Armenian. Well, he thought it was important enough that he got someone who knew Armenian to translate a number of documents, a number of books for him, so that from these translations he was able to dig out the information he wanted to include in this 2-volume work, Diplomacy of Imperialism. But most scholars are not willing to go through that trouble, to go through the expense and the time and effort to dig out this material in a language that is strange to them. Therefore, if much of our material, which is buried in the Armenian language, in the classical as well as the Ashkara part, can be made available in the English, this will be of value not only to us, but to English-speaking scholars. And when I introduce Professor Langer, and when you hear him, I think you'll hear more about the values of such a program as we envision. However, at this time, I'd like to introduce a little break in our program here. We've been very fortunate in having with us a young lady who is an excellent violinist. I have heard her in the past. Unfortunately, I don't know too much about her history to be able to give you a proper introduction, but I'm sure that her violin playing will speak for itself. So that without much further ado, Miss Mary Avakian and Miss Shaki Ahoyan on the piano.
presumption.
greetings of the Commonwealth and my own best wishes to the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research on the occasion of your meeting this evening. May I congratulate the Association on its plans for the advancement of Armenian studies through scholarship, research, and publication, and wish for this movement the greatest of success. My sincere best wishes and warmest personal regards, Christian A. Herder, Governor of the Commonwealth. The next speaker is one who probably is not as familiar to most of us as Armenians as he is to those of us who have done some work in the field of history. Whenever you speak to someone who is a historian or who has done any research or extensive study in history, whether it be European history, Middle Eastern history, or American diplomatic history, the name of William L. Langer is well known. I like to particularly single out an important contribution that Professor Langer has made in connection with the book that I already mentioned that he has written, Diplomacy of Imperialism. I mentioned that there are over 100 pages in this book devoted to the Armenian question of the 1880s and 1890s. Some of you, I know, have read this book, and some of you have possibly some quarrels with Professor Langer on some of his interpretations. But to me, the book is much more important for another reason. It is one of the few books which examines Armenian history in terms of Middle Eastern history and in terms of European history and in terms of world history. This has been another trouble with Armenian history up to the present, that is the study of Armenian. Too much has Armenian history been studied in a vacuum without taking into account all of the forces and influence and movements that have had their effect on the development of the Armenian nation and the Armenian civilization. And this book, published in the early 1930s, is one of the first books written by a non-Armenian in America where he gives due recognition to the problems and the history of the Armenian people at a particular period in their history and relates it in terms of the world events that were going on, because much of Armenian history can only be understood in terms of the events that were going on outside of it. The author, Professor Langer, is at present Coolidge Professor of History here at the university. He is director of the Center of Middle Eastern Studies. He is chairman of the Committee on Regional Studies. He received his education here from Harvard, his bachelor's degree and his PhD both, and he also has received a Doctor of Laws degree, an honorary degree from Harvard University. He was a professor of history at Clark University for 4 years before he came to Harvard here in 1927. Since then, he has been visiting professor and lecturer at Columbia, Yale, and the University of Chicago. During the war, for 4 years, he was chief of the Research and Analysis Branch of the Office of Strategic Services. For this work, he was offered the Medal for Merit and he was presented with a citation from President Truman in July of 1946 for this work. In 1946, he was also a special assistant to the Secretary of State. During 1950 and 51, he was an assistant director of national estimates of the Central Intelligence Agency. And even today, many times when I go to see Professor Langer, I am informed by his secretary that he is in Washington consulting with government officials on American foreign policy problems. He has been the author of numerous books, of which I only mention one. He has been the editor of a series of books that come out under the heading of The Rise of Modern Europe. He has been the editor and compiler of a best-selling encyclopedia of world history. And recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, he has co-authored 2 volumes on the early parts of America's involvement in World War II. The books are called The Challenge to Isolation and The Undeclared War. And I understand he is working on a 3rd one right now. I would like to introduce to you Professor Langer, who will speak to you as a representative of Harvard University and what its interests are in Armenian studies. Professor Langer.
Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, when Mr. Young gave me my sailing orders for the night, he threatened me with very serious consequences if I exceeded the time limit he had set for me. As I recall it, he mentioned some fantastic figure like 5 minutes or something of that sort. Well, it seems to me that I'm old enough to do things my own way, even to the point of reminiscing here for a moment. And I'm impelled to do this by a remark Mr. Young made about my beloved colleague, Professor Frye. He said Professor Frye had difficulty learning classical Armenian. I find it utterly impossible to believe this, because I don't believe that Mr. Frye ever had difficulty learning any language. I think it was, must have been a year or 2 before the recent war, when one morning a very bright-looking young lad, he looked very young, showed up at my office in the library, and he had a letter of recommendation from a Professor Albert Leibeyer at the University of Illinois, who was a very well-known authority on Middle Eastern history and a man who had trained a good many scholars in that field. And incidentally, Leibeyer himself had been trained here at Harvard by Professor Coolidge, who was the man who built up the great Near Eastern collections in the library here, who trained Professor Blake, and under whom I myself studied, and so forth and so on. Anyway, Leibeyer was a great scholar, but he was not given to effusions and compliments. Nobody ever expected him to overflow with kind words. But he, in these recommendations that he had sent along with Mr. Frye, he simply went all overboard. There never had been anybody like Mr. Frye. He was positively a genius. Well, even then I was old enough to begin to discount things, and I said to myself, well, he may be good, but nobody could be this good. And I kind of made a point of watching to see what happened to him as the wheels of Harvard began to grind down on him. Well, all I can say is that when he came and he was very young, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to study all this Middle Eastern area, and he wanted to study Central Asia and so, and I kept on raising objections. I said, think of all the languages you'd have to learn. Why, if you went into Central Asia, you'd even have to learn Chinese. He says, I know it. I'm going to learn Chinese. Well, he ended up learning Chinese, and he learned Japanese, too, for that matter. So all I can say is that he turned out all that was expected of him, and even more. And for that reason, I just can't believe that Armenian ever caused him any difficulty whatever. Well, to get down to the assignment which I have been given as the director of the new Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at Harvard, I am very happy to bring you the greetings of the university and to say that, of course, the university must sympathize with the objectives which you have set for yourself, namely the encouragement of Armenian studies and the ultimate establishment of an endowed professorship for Armenian studies at Harvard University. After all, the purpose of universities is to preserve knowledge and to expand our learning and our understanding. And there is nothing in the least bit unusual or extraordinary in this suggestion that Harvard make itself responsible for the preservation and propagation of Armenian studies, because, as has been said here this evening, this is a field that is recognized to be not only interesting but important, not only of local interest but of broader interest and in fact of general interest. Harvard has always had an interest in this field, as you can derive from the fact that people like Coolidge and Blake and others have pursued Armenian studies and Middle Eastern studies in one phase or another over a good many years and have built up the library here. And we have recently established the Center for Middle Eastern Studies in order to expand the instruction and the research in the Middle Eastern field and to integrate it, to weave it all together into a meaningful pattern. Now, in order to start this Center for Middle Eastern Studies, we had to have more money than the university would normally be able to devote to this area or to this field. And that leads me to point out to you that it's a very gross error to suppose that Harvard has a lot of money lying around. It certainly is a very prevalent misconception that Harvard is rolling in wealth. Why, people say they have hundreds of millions of dollars over there, you know, and every now and then I open the paper in the morning and I see that he's got another $3 million within the last 6 months. Well, they do, but it's an awfully big university and it's got an awful lot to do, and every student that goes through the university costs the university money. No tuition that any student ever pays around here pays for his education. The only way that education can be paid for is from the interest of the endowed funds that the university has. It's only from those funds that the tremendous plant, the laboratories, the buildings, the dormitories, or what have you, can be maintained. And it's only from those funds that the libraries can be maintained and built up. Well, I'm not going to go into a disquisition on Harvard finances here, but I can assure you that while we are not bankrupt, we are in the position of all universities, and particularly of all private universities, suffering severely from the inflation of recent years and having a very tough time making both ends meet. I would say under these circumstances, Harvard has been offering instruction in Middle Eastern history and civilization for a long time. And as you know from what has been said here, Professor Frye has been giving instruction in Armenian as far as that is concerned. But if there is going to be anything beyond that, if there is going to be a special emphasis, if Harvard is to become the center for Armenian studies, and here I revert again to what has been said, to my knowledge there is no center anywhere in the world for Armenian studies. And I would almost go so far as to say, to my knowledge, there is no really good history of Armenia in existence in any language that I've ever heard of. So that there's a lot to be done, and it is urgently necessary, or at least highly desirable, that somewhere there should be a place where these studies can be developed, where research can be done, where our knowledge can be brought onto the basis of modern scholarship. And I hope very much that this will be Harvard, because I think we are equipped to do that job and would have a very great interest in doing it. But if it is to be done, then the people who are interested have got to find the additional funds to do it. And let me point out to you that this is what is happening all the time, over and over at Harvard. Down in Washington, in that beautiful estate on Rock Creek Park, Dumbarton Oaks, Harvard has a special institute devoted to Byzantine studies. Well, that was given to Harvard by the Mr. and Mrs. Bliss, this beautiful estate with the wonderful library that went with it, the accommodations, the money that enabled students to go there. I don't mean students in the sense of freshmen or sophomores, but students in terms of competent research people spend a year or two studying various topics in Byzantine history and publishing them and so forth and so on. In the same way, we have coming here next September to the new Center for Middle Eastern Studies the great British Arabic scholar Sir Hamilton Gibb, perhaps one of the 2 or 3 most prominent students of Arabic civilization and Islamic religion in the world. How can we do this? Well, he is coming to accept a highly endowed professorship of Arabic, the Jewett Professorship of Arabic. Then there are other endowed professorships like the Littauer Professorship for the study of the biblical languages and things of that sort. I myself hold the Coolidge Professorship, which was established by the Professor Coolidge, whom I mentioned some time ago. In other words, Harvard is full of special endowments, special professorships, which have been financed by people or by groups who have a particular interest in furthering a particular field of study, and there is nothing unusual in the idea that any Armenian or any Armenian group should raise the money to provide for more extensive and more intensive study of Armenian history and of Armenian civilization. Well, now you may say, well, supposing we raised the money, whom would you appoint? Well, we don't know whom we would appoint. I can tell you only one thing. We would appoint the best man in the world today, and no one less than that. And let me just tell you how this is done. It's an awful business to get anybody appointed to a professorship at Harvard. If a professorship becomes vacant through the death of some professor or through the retirement of a professor, the department in which he is teaching holds long meetings, frequently very tedious meetings, surveying not only the whole country but the whole world to find out where the most competent, the most outstanding successor is to be found. And when they have finally agreed, and they have to agree almost unanimously before they can recommend it to the president. Of course, there are always departments in which there's, a constitutional obstructionist, some member who is just by nature negative, and so, but these men get to be known, and a vote is practically unanimous if they're the only ones in the opposition. But once we have reached that point, we recommend to the dean and to the president that this man be appointed. Well, now you'd think that that would be enough, but that's only the beginning. Because the president, instead of trusting his own department as you'd think he would, then proceeds to set up what is known as an ad hoc committee. And this is a committee of about 5 people, all eminent people in the field, but not at Harvard, at other universities, at Chicago, at California, or places of that sort. And after he has communicated to them the decision of the department and the reasons why the department recommends this man, has given them time to think it over and so on, has given them time to read this professor's books and check for themselves to see how good he is, then these men are called to Cambridge at the university's expense. and they frequently come for long distances. They spend at least a day here at Harvard, and they spend it with the president, and the president calls in the senior members of the department, and they are put through their paces, because these visitors say, well, didn't you consider so-and-so at the University of Oshkosh, or have you considered so-and-so at the University of Algiers, and why didn't you consider him? I think he's better than the man you have selected, and so on. This goes on for hours. It goes on all day, unless the department can satisfy these visitors also that this is the best man and that their reasons for selecting him are good reasons. The president simply sends the thing back for further consideration. There is only one objective, and the president rubs this in again and again. Only the best man can be appointed here, and consequently there is not the slightest, not the remotest chance of any favoritism or any pushing of a particular individual because perhaps he was a Harvard man originally, or anything of that sort. It's done completely on what you might call a dispassionate and rather painful basis. And if we were to appoint a professor in the field of Armenian studies, we would first of all comb the whole world for the man who looks to us to be the most appropriate appointment, and then we would have to go through this agonizing reappraisal, as the phrase now goes, before we could get the president to accept the recommendation and the corporation to vote approval on it. So that I want to say right here now, as far as the professorship is concerned, if this money were ever to be raised for Armenian studies, you could not only be assured, as Mr. Young has said, that the money would be used for this purpose and no other for the next 5 years or 50 years or 500 years. There could be no question on that score whatever, but I think there could also be no question whatever that the best man in this field in the world today would be here, and that his influence, his knowledge, his inspiration would make itself felt throughout the entire scholarly world and, of course, throughout the entire Armenian community. Well, now, of course, a professorship is a wonderful thing, and I agree that it would be the key to the future development of Armenian studies, but there are all these other things, these lesser things that can be done in the way of fellowships, in the way of books for the library, and all that sort of thing, things which it will be your affair to consider. I have already so far exceeded my allotment of time that I now begin to have grave fears for my future, so I will bring my remarks to a close at this point, thanking you for coming here in such number and showing such interest in what, after all, is a matter of learning and of long-term education. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Langer. You'll have a chance to have some more opportunity to expound your views when we have the question period. Professor Langer mentioned the agonizing reappraisal that has to go on in the selection of a man for a job like that of Professor of Armenian Studies. I would like to assure you that when we as an organization decided that the first chair of Armenian Studies in America should be at Harvard University and nowhere else, this was not a decision that came overnight. It was not a decision that was taken for granted. We sat down for many hours and we went over all the reasons. And every way we looked at it, Harvard came out on top, and I can assure you. I would just like to give you a few of the reasons. First of all, it's the oldest and probably the most outstanding university in America and is world renowned. Secondly, it has the best Armenian collection of any university in America. Thirdly, it has the largest library, public or private, in America. Fourthly, it has a tradition of Armenian studies. Professor Lake, Professor Frye, many others in the past have been interested in Armenian studies and have done work. In addition to that, they have research facilities, departments, other professors who can contribute a lot to the furthering of Armenian studies. Professor Langer mentioned the Dumbarton Oaks Library. I would like to inform you who the acting director of that library is. The acting director of studies of the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection is none other than Professor Serapi Dernesesyan, professor of Byzantine art and archaeology, who has written a book herself on Armenia and the Byzantine Empire. Right now on the Harvard faculty there are 10 members at least who have either done research or who have written books or who have written articles on various aspects of Armenian history or culture. 10 members right now on the Harvard faculty. And last but not least, although it has no connection with Armenian studies, on the Harvard faculty there are 4 Armenian professors and there are 6 research associates and fellows. 10 people altogether on the teaching and research staff of Harvard University who are of Armenian extraction. This is a record I don't think any university in the United States can come close to. We had to be sure of all of these reasons, plus a lot of others. The fact that Harvard is at the center of the largest Armenian community in America. The fact that Harvard is close to other Armenian libraries, such as the Armenian Cultural Foundation, such as the collection at the Boston Public Library, such as it's not being too far from New York City, where there are other collections. We also took into account that Harvard is at the center of not only the Armenian community, but within this same community we have the 2 Armenian daily newspapers, where they have their own files and their own information that research workers would have to go to. All of these were reasons that we had to take into account, because when we go to California and we ask somebody in California to give some money for a Harvard chair 3,000 miles away, we have to be able to satisfy that man out there that it should be at Harvard and not at California first, that we should have the first Armenian chair in America. Get the first one. Let the second one be in California if you want. This is a tremendous job. We haven't mentioned to you yet what it is in terms of finances, what it is in terms of organization. In terms of organization, you probably already can sense the need. That's why we have created this organization. We have to have some sort of a machinery, some sort of an agency that will carry this out. And this association is the agency. Now I would like to call upon as the next speaker someone who is well known in the Armenian community, in the older Armenian community, who will try to explain this a little further in terms of the responsibility of the Armenian community towards the success of this project. The next speaker is a member of the State Board of Education. He's director of the Bureau of Vocational Counsel. He's a member of the State Educational Television Commission. He's a member of many other educational committees and activities, and he has given us in our organization unstinting cooperation and unbounding enthusiasm And there have been days when our job has seemed so tiresome, so thankless, but Mr. Gregory has always come with his cheerful face and his encouragement and his enthusiasm, and we younger people have been taking a lot of encouragement from him. So I would like to introduce to you Mr. John Gregory.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I took some notes in my office for a speech. I forgot it. I am happy to say that I forgot it because most of the things I had put down were already mentioned by the previous speakers. And being toward the end of the succession of speakers, it is logical that I should help you to come to some conclusion about the matter. Now, this dream of letting the world know about Armenians is an old dream. How old? Ever since we lost our independence, after a few centuries after we lost our independence, the world showed a tendency to be more concerned with people and races who were in the forefront of success. The world has a peculiar way of forgetting those who suddenly fail or face trouble. If the world had known through such competent sources as Harvard and competent people like Dr. Frye, Dr. Langer, and many others perhaps, our lot in life, I am sure would have been very different. Only a voice in wilderness, like Gladstone said, to serve Armenians is to serve civilization. But it was just a voice in wilderness, without documentation, without objective research, without books to support. And the world is most impressed by statements which are backed by facts, scientific data, research. Professor Langer stated that we don't have really a good Armenian history, and we don't. Because some of our historians, being Armenians, are carried by their wonderful imagination too, and not always by facts, historical facts. Now, can this be done? All this demand of years now is facing a challenge tonight. Starting in Boston, a real challenge, a serious one. Harvard University is an institution that has no time to spend on frivolities, I assure you. It's almost a challenge for our self-respect too, so far as an educational institution is concerned. Now, can we do it? When I visit Egypt, and I used to when I lived in Cyprus on weekends, I saw an old Egyptian statue. It was a bull with a forelock and no tail in the back. It was sculptured in a dashing position, running. And I asked the Egyptian guide, I said, "What's the name of the statue?" He said, "Opportunity." You either hold it by the forelock as it comes dashing at you, or if you let it pass by, it doesn't even have a tail to hold on to. Can this thing be done? Yes, if we catch the opportunity by its forelock and keep on with it. That's the only way it can be done. Is it not too big a project? Of course it is. But it is not beyond our capacity to do it. You know, we are a tremendously interesting people with tremendous creative powers. I and many of you are the children or the sufferers of the greatest persecution in the world almost 30 years ago, and look at us now. We are successful, we are happy, we are contributing to our neighbors, to America. We always have been a people of constructive contributions. But unfortunately, during the past 600 years, we have adopted a method of isolation rather than communication through the world of what we have. Our forefathers, when I was reading a history of one incident of Armenians in classical Armenian, our forefathers saw that their neighbors knew about them and they had respect for them. Do we have a culture that's good enough for the world to know? Yes. Are we an interesting enough people for outsiders to do an objective research and present their findings to the world? Admittedly we are. Can we really make a valuable contribution of our past and of our present to America, to all the rest of the world? I think we can. How are we going to do it? Not by words. We have talked too long, my friends. The time has come to act. And we have talked too long among ourselves. We have blamed our young generation, saying that why are they interested in Armenians? You know, I dealt with young generation's problems for many years. And they said, well, what do you think we should know about Armenian people as the children of Armenians? I went to libraries to find some books in English written on Armenian culture or history. I could not find it. And I had to come and admit that we have no time to teach them, and there aren't enough books in English to teach them. But we kept on blaming them for not taking more active interest in their racial background, in their racial culture. How can they? They are no magicians. Now, it can be done. $300,000, it can be raised. It can be raised. You find 20,000 Armenians who will contribute $20 each. Can't we find it among 250,000 Armenians? I think we can. Oh, it can't be done tomorrow, or 2 months later, or 3 months later. But no one expects that. But let the trickles come in. The lake will be formed, and we'll see its waves ripple under the moonlight of a cultural center for Armenian studies. Now, my friends, faith has moved mountains. If 1,504 years ago your forefathers under Vartan did not take bold action and decide to fight against Persians, perhaps we wouldn't have existed today. And the world did not believe that they could succeed, but they decided to fight. And they said, your sword, our neck, your suffering, our patience, but never shall we give up our freedom to worship God as we want. Did they succeed? Yes, they did. They preserved, they fought, I think, the first battle for religious freedom in the world. They succeeded, and they won. They lost, but they won the right to keep their religion. And we here tonight are at the Phillips Brooks house. And I remember a story about Phillips Brooks. He gave a sermon. He was a wonderful preacher. You should read some of his sermons. I love them. He gave a sermon one day, and after the sermon, a Harvard professor of English went to him and he said, Phillips, you gave a very good sermon, but your English was atrocious. I think you should improve it. Phillips Brooks turned to him and he said, Professor, I am doing the best I can with the modest and little talents God has given me. Are you doing your best with yours? You say we are small? Let's do our best. But let's get up and do our best. And believe me, that money will come. Thank you.
The last speaker has begun to touch on some of the practical matters that go with the setting up of a chair of Armenian Studies. Let me assure you today, right now, this is not a money-raising meeting, so relax. Our next speaker will fill you in a little bit more about the financial problem of establishing a chair, of promoting Armenian Studies. He will also try to acquaint you with the organizational problems that we have, why we have asked you to come here and listen to us. But before I introduce him, I think you ought to hear a few more things about this organization we have. We have an organization which already has 43 founding members from here in the greater Boston area. 40 of the names are listed on your sheet. 3 of them just came in this morning. So let me give you the additions to the 40 names that are on your sheet. They're Ruben Gregorian, Peter Irajan, and Harry Healer. These are the 3 names to be added on to the list. As you look over that list, you'll see familiar names. But one thought should come to your mind as you look over that list, that here is a representative group of Armenians, young and old, wealthy and not so wealthy, of this political belief and of that political belief, of this religion and of that religion. This is a fundamental point, a fundamental aspect or character of this organization. It is non-profit, it is non-political, it is non-partisan, and it is non-sectarian. This is an organization where we hope you can put your differences outside the door when you come in here and you try to work together in furthering Armenian studies. This is the only way in which this project can succeed. We have 8 members on our board of directors at present. Those names are starred on your sheet. They will be appointed to the board of directors. Later on in the spring, probably in April or early May, there will be an annual meeting where those of you who want to join this organization today and become charter members will be able to come and set policies for this organization for the future. We have a constitution, a provisional constitution. We have copies of it, and those of you who are interested in it can get one if you ask us for one. We have also achieved some success already. First and foremost has been the establishment of Armenian courses under the Department of Education, Division of University Extension. This is the first time the public announcement is being made that we were the ones who were responsible for these courses. That has been going on under the instructorship of Dr. Avakian and Mr. Ekmekjan, who was sitting over there. These courses would not have been a reality if it were not for our organization contacting the Department of Education and convincing them that they could succeed if they would only start them up. One clarification I would like to make at this point. Many people reading that these courses are being given here at Harvard think that Harvard has something to do with these courses. Harvard has nothing to do with these courses. Harvard only gives the buildings through the Department of Education to use for these courses. These are not Harvard courses. This is not the chair for Armenian Studies. This is something in between, interim, provisional, something we are doing now until such time as we can have a chair and have a permanent program of studies and language, literature, culture, and the other aspects of Armenian history and civilization. So please don't confuse this which has been done with that which is to be done. We have had other successes already. We have made contact or made arrangements with one individual so that his father's collection of Armenian books, totaling some 500 volumes, will be donated to the Harvard University Library just as soon as legal problems are cleared up. We have already had conferences with Princeton University officials. I was at Princeton in November as a representative of this organization in a meeting with the chairman of the Department of Languages and Literatures, in which meeting there was present Professor Bonfanti, from whom I read you a greeting a little while ago. And they are thinking of starting Armenian courses much more actively than they are doing now. And when that time comes, they want the support and cooperation and assistance of our organization. We already have members from California, even before coming out into the open. We have members from Los Angeles. We have members from San Francisco. We have charter members from Chicago, from Detroit, and from New York, already, before we even had come out in the open today. This is a movement that will catch fire, and it will be up to you people to cooperate with us, to join us, to become a part of it, and show us maybe how better we can do our job and help us do it. I would like to introduce to you at this point the practical man in our outfit, the money man, the treasurer of our board of directors. Also, some of you know him as the president of Union Motor Sales in Somerville, well known in the Armenian community, a graduate of MIT, a former instructor of physics at MIT, always having been interested in Armenian history and culture. In fact, he told me 20 years ago we thought of something like this when we were students around here, but we couldn't think of the right answer. We didn't know what the right approach was. And we're glad to see that you people have come along and have provided the answer. I would like to introduce you, therefore, Mr. J. Mark Kolligian.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first off, I have been accustomed to paying for plugs that I get once in a while, and I'm very thankful for the plug that you did give me. I think probably the best compliment you could pay any man is to call him a practical man, and I want to thank you for that too. I have been sitting down there and listening to the story almost with a tingle up my spine, and I hope that you have felt the same way. We've all heard the story. It's a wonderful undertaking. It's inspiring, it's ambitious, and best of all, it's possible. And you have, by your very excellent attendance this evening, encouraged us to believe that the goal will be reached quicker and surer than we had probably hoped for before. Being the last speaker is not probably the best thing in the world. I had written a few notes myself, and unlike Mr. Gregory, I hadn't forgotten mine. I brought him along. But it seems that every paragraph I had has been covered so very beautifully and in much more eloquent language than I could have done. I think I might continue with the practical angle of this matter and say that we would like to see, incidentally, I'm being very practical about this approach to the problem too. I would like to say that our very first objective is to at least get some basis or some practical thing in motion in just as quick a time as we can, and I would say insofar as Harvard is concerned, a quick time might be 20 years, but insofar as I'm concerned, a quick time might be, well, in the next 5 minutes. But, I mean, this is neither the 20 years or the 5 minutes. I would like to think in terms of, let's say, the next year. I would like to feel that the objective of this association would be something in the range of, well, let's say $30,000 to $50,000. Now, $30,000 isn't too much, and I have a method to my madness. I don't want to scare people to death. I'd like to feel that the first goal will be possible of attainment, and I'd like to also believe in the old saw that nothing succeeds like success, and having had one success, we can go on to the second one. Now, the second objective would be an additional $70,000, which would give us a total of $100,000, with which we could establish all sorts of things. I mean, we could have fellowships and research fellows, and we could have even a visiting lecturer with that money. Now, mind you, when we talk about that money, I mean, we're going to have to admonish the words of a typical Boston Brahmin, Brahmin's advice to his son. My boy, never touch the principal, never. So we don't touch the principal, but we work on the interest from that money. So with the $100,000, and I've been given by good authority that maybe $100,000 can be worked at 4.8%, we'd have a pretty good sum coming in, and with that we could do all sorts of things. Now, I have some sheets here which shows the breakdown, so I won't go into it, and I'll pass those out so you'll know what I'm talking about. The third objective would be an $80,000 goal, which would give us a total of $180,000, and then the final goal would be $120,000 more, completing the $300,000. And having arrived at this point, the proceeds will establish, and God willing for all time, the chair of Armenian Studies, and we will have realized, as Mr. Gregory says, the dream of many, many centuries. Now, these undertakings can be started with the very first few dollars that we might get. I mean, we've got this thing broken down on the sheet, and I'm going to pass them out to you so you'll know what I'm talking about. Arra, would you see that these are given out?
She's already given out.
Oh, do they have those? I don't believe they have those. Yeah. You might notice from those sheets that the $300,000 is on top, and I chose to present it to you in the reverse order. So if you'll bear with me and begin at the bottom of the set of figures down there, the first $1,000 will accrue $48 a year, with which we can start our undertaking. Now, don't think for 1 minute that I'm entertaining any $1,000 goal of any sort, either for 1 day or for 1 week or anything like that, but this is brought down to the, from the accomplishment down to the most ridiculous, of $48, which will allow the purchase of books and periodicals for libraries. Now, I'm not going to go through the minor few changes there in between, but go up to, say, $30,000, which will accrue $1,500 a year, with which a fellowship or a scholarship could be established. Then as you go up the ladder, you'll see that $50,000 will be capable of establishing a teaching fellowship, and then $100,000 a research fellowship postdoctoral, and then the $150,000 visiting lectureship, and then all the way up to the top. Now, this is not intended to be a fundraising campaign, and as Mr. Young said, we want to put you at ease. And we would have probably launched on a fundraising campaign right at this moment if it hadn't been for the fact that we recognize that the Armenian Apostolic Church of Boston, Greater Boston, is on the verge of launching a campaign for a building fund right here on Brattle Street in Cambridge. We don't wish to obstruct their aims. We don't wish to in any way interfere with their efforts. We think that Armenian culture, Armenian literature, history, and everything else is tied in so closely with the Armenian Church that both efforts are pretty much in the same channel. However, we do feel that we can come to you at this time and say, if it is within the realm of your understanding of this evening's program, we'd like you to become a charter member. And we'd also like to expose ourselves sufficiently so that you can ask us questions. We have tried, as you might see, to make it about as simple as possible by not only telling you about it, but also putting it in print. Now, there are certain aspects of fundraising in this day and age which is peculiar to the tax setup of this United States at this time. I don't believe anybody mentioned that any money that you give to this particular endeavor is tax-free, tax exempt. So that if you are the owner of a corporation earning over $30,000, you will be taxed 52%. So if you gave $10,000, you would be contributing only $4,800 out of pocket, and Uncle Sam would be contributing the other $5,200. Now, we have a few lawyers in our midst, and I think there are a few other little kinks in the law, too, that will enable you to pay, get your name in its proper niche in this particular undertaking without costing you too much money. And frankly, although I like Uncle Sam, I don't mind taking a few bucks away from him whenever I can, as long as I'm within the law. I know there was one thing more I had to cover. I'm just trying to think of what it is. Oh, yeah. Down at the bottom of this sheet, you'll see a few more notations on here, and I'm going to read it. If you'll bear with me, I think this is probably as well done on the paper as it would be otherwise. First, all endowed funds for less than $300,000 can be set up as open-end endowments so that they can be combined with other gifts or funds at a later date in order to establish an endowed professorship or chair of Armenian Studies. All sums donated to the university capital or endowed fund will be invested by the university, and the yield will be available for us for the advancement of Armenian Studies and research within 1 year of the investment. In other words, the money's got to work for a year before you get anything for it. That's about pretty much in essence what that means. Endowed funds of $15,000 or more can be designated as name funds as follows. Well, let's say it's Margos Giragosyan Armenian Studies Fund, to be used for the advancement of Armenian Studies at Harvard University at the discretion of the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies and other designated university officials to provide in part or full for personnel, researchers, instructors, professorships, fellowships, scholarships, publications, subsidies, and so forth, and or books and periodicals for the library, and to be combined with other funds when and only if thereby an endowed professorship or chair of Armenian Studies can be established. Such funds can also be set up in the memory of an individual or in honor of a renowned person. Gifts under $15,000 except those for the library, cannot be set up as name funds. However, they will be invested, and the yield from such investments will be used annually to further Armenian studies at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies or other departments qualified to undertake Armenian studies and research. Such gifts will be combined with other funds or donations to establish or augment endowed scholarships, fellowships, or professorships. Now, it might seem from all this conversation that this endeavor is going to involve nickels, dimes, and dollar bills, but it isn't. I think that is a job even us young people wouldn't dare undertake. But we believe that once we have the basis of the fund, we have, let's say, $40,000 to $50,000, with which we can start some of the things that are listed in here. We also have the wholehearted cooperation of the community. We can then go to people who are sufficiently established and sufficiently capable of making large donations. I don't wish to name names, I don't wish to name foundations or anything.